The Sine Institute of Policy and Politics is American University's incubator for policy innovation. We convene leaders in the academic, public, private, nonprofit, and journalism sectors to engage and promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. In an evolving world, we seize the opportunity to work on the nation's most pressing challenges through collaboration by experts and top scholars in their field with students in research and scholarship. As part of that goal, the Sine Institute leverages American University's location in our nation's capital, the nexus of government and a growing international business center. We connect diverse perspectives from around the country and around the world with our world-class academics and research, experienced practitioners, and the most politically active student body in the U.S. We stand apart through our focus on the role of business and the nonprofit community in public policy, the rise of the importance of economic regions in the United States, and international policy issues. Our focus is to make an immediate impact at the intersection of policy and politics that leads to real and lasting change. Thank you for joining us as we convene, communicate, and collaborate. Introducing Sine Institute Fellow 2022, Shannon Watts.
Hey everyone, thank you for joining again to discuss organizing. I want to remind everyone that this lecture and the last few that I've had, and there's one more coming up, they are based on my book, Fight Like a Mother. And so if you are interested in finding out more information, the courses that we've talked about are from that book. So we have spoken so far about change legislatively. We have talked about electoral change. And now today we're going to be talking about cultural change, which is a very important part of social movements in general in this country. So our objectives today, we want to talk about a few things. Specifically, I want to talk about women's activism and the history of that in America. Women have obviously changed the country electorally and legislatively. I think because we haven't had a lot of power historically, and in fact have only been able to vote, for 100 years or so. A lot of the change that we have been responsible for in this country has been based on our work culturally. I also want to, let me go back here. I also want to talk about the importance of cultural change. Why does it matter? How does it fit in with legislative and electoral change? And what is the role that it plays? What are you trying to achieve through that? And then we're going to have a discussion with a friend of mine, Norri Leder, who has been a volunteer with Moms Demand Action for a very long time. She lives in Texas and has worked on this issue in all the ways we've spoken about, legislative, electoral, cultural, and really can speak to what it's like to do this work in a red state, what it's like to affect change, and why cultural work is so important when you have lawmakers who aren't really acting in the best interests of their constituents. We're going to talk about partnerships. That really does dovetail, because so often what you're doing with partners is changing the culture. You're creating coalitions. You're creating relationships with people who bring something to the table that you can't or don't. We're going to have a conversation with two local activists and talk really about the work that they have done and how cultural change and partnerships have played a role in the work that they're doing. And then, as always, we will finish with next steps and ways that you can take this information and get involved too. So I think the history of women in activism is an important and interesting one. I always say that women are really the secret sauce of activism in this country. Some people say if you want something done, ask a busy woman or mom. I think that women are really excellent multitaskers. I talk about this in my book, Fight Like a Mother, why women and moms in particular make such great activists. They multitask, they don't give up, they understand the importance and significance of incremental change, and frankly, their role, I'm not saying that it is something that is born in us, but I think the way that we are raised in society is that we take responsibility for the safety of our children and of our communities. And so naturally, the activism we do often dovetails with those concerns. So I think the history is really interesting. If you go back to when women first got off the sidelines and started getting involved in activism, it started back in the mid 1800s to early 1900s, and really suffrage and prohibition were happening at the same time. And they're very interesting and unique tales of activism. If you look at, for example, prohibition, and oftentimes people say, historians say, that this is when women were really first allowed to get off the sidelines and to become activists. And why? Why did men who were typically lawmakers and were solely allowed to be involved in the political realm, why did they allow women to have a voice on prohibition? Why did they allow them to get involved? And it was because temperance, the abstinence of alcohol, was considered a Christian value, and that is, what was at the forefront of national politics at the time. And this idea that somehow women could save society from the ills of alcoholism, much of which did involve domestic abuse, abuse of women, abuse of children. It was sort of that women were set up to be the front-facing activists on prohibition, hoping that they could affect change by telling their stories, by pulling on the heartstrings of lawmakers, by talking about so-called Christian values and the need to make this huge change, right? Essentially an amendment to the Constitution. And so again, women were put out front. As a result, women were often vilified around an amendment that was so incredibly controversial. So if you have learned about prohibition, you know that Carrie Nation is the person who is often blamed for what is now, looking back in history, seen as a foible, that this amendment shouldn't have been passed, that temperance was taking away people's freedoms and rights. Interestingly, Carrie Nation actually died a decade before temperance even happened. It was really men who were behind the scenes forcing this to happen. So in January 1919, the 18th Amendment was something that all state legislatures were considering. It was a midterm election, and it really was unprecedented how quickly states adopted and voted for prohibition. It was 46 out of the 48 states. Just in that time period in 1918, many states unanimously approved. And yet, when the amendment passed, the 18th Amendment, it was before the 19th Amendment, which means that women couldn't even vote. And yet again, in history, if you go back and you look, it is often women who are blamed for prohibition. I think what is interesting is that regardless of how prohibition fared throughout the last century, what has remained is a real desire for women to stay involved in activism. So men really were not able to put the genie back in the bottle around activism. And so since then, women have really been on the front line. I think suffrage is also an interesting case study around women and activism. Again, if you go back to sort of the mid 1800s, 1848 is when the Seneca Falls meeting happened. It was really something that historians say was the start of the suffrage movement in this country. It was actually a very, very small meeting, and that is the case in history in this country and how we're taught. There was actually a meeting before Seneca Falls that was even more important and that was larger. It was the spring before. It was in Philadelphia, and it was Black women from African Methodist Episcopal churches, AME churches, who got together and started talking about women's rights, and specifically, these were church-going women who wanted licenses to preach. So they were talking about their ability to take center stage, and they knew that they would need to organize around voting in order to make that happen, right? So we don't hear about that meeting. We often hear about Seneca Falls. if you stay focused on sort of the white women path of suffrage, 20 years later, in the late 1860s, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, we all know this story. They founded the National Women's Suffrage Association, and they started to begin working to ratify the 19th Amendment. And eventually they were able to do that in 1919. But if you look at the path for all women to have the right to vote, it took much longer than that. As the right to vote for women happened, we were simultaneously, as a country, passing laws that actually limited the freedoms of Black Americans, in particular Black women. And so the fight continued. Sadly, white women did not often join that fight. It was really Black women who had to organize themselves. They started a whole new movement around voting rights in the summer of 2020. And it really took until the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which was, 100 years later, for voting to become a reality for Black women. Also, Black women have been sort of the backbone of democracy in this country, in terms of activism and working many times thanklessly, invisibly, for the rights of everyone, and certainly themselves. And then if you look at how women have been involved also in organizing, you have to look at child labor laws. So you take all the things that women learned from suffrage and from prohibition, and women realized that American children were working in large numbers in coal mines and glass factories, in textile mills, in agriculture, canneries, home industries. They were newsboys, messengers, bootblacks, peddlers. And so all of this union organizing and child labor reform were really intertwined. And so organizations, mostly of women, right? Working women, middle-class women, they got together and created societies that would completely overhaul the way unions acted, and that they were more accepted, and also that reformed child labor laws. And that was really how in the 20th century, in the 1900s, that women were involved in activism. So then you flash forward into the 2000s, and look, there's so many examples of women organizing and being at the forefront of activism. I'm just touching on a few that impact, in my mind, the activism of gun safety advocates, and in particular women. I've talked about this in my other seminars. I started Moms Demand Action because I was a teen in the 1980s, in middle school and high school, and Mothers Against Drunk Driving was just so incredibly influential. And it wasn't just their legislative work, which actually took over a decade. And it certainly wasn't their electoral work, because that is not their claim to fame. It was really their cultural work. And I'm not sure how many of you know the story of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, but it started in 1980. And there was a mom whose daughter, she was 13 years old. Her name was Carrie. Her daughter, Candace Leitner's daughter, Carrie, was killed at 13 in a drunk driving crash. And this was in California, and Candace Leitner decided that she was going to work with other moms whose children were victims of crashes. And the reason I say crash is because Mothers Against Drunk Driving actually changed the language so that you would no longer say accident, you would say crash, which to me is much like with Moms Demand Action. We never say an accidental shooting, we say unintentional. We never say committed suicide, we say die by suicide. We don't say gun control, we say gun safety, right? So MAD showed us that language matters. And in fact, when they started MAD in 1980 in Sacramento, California, they called it Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. And then they decided that they didn't want to be against the drivers, they wanted to be against the driving. And so they actually changed their name 4 years later to Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And they've had such huge success as an organization, much of it cultural. But in 1984, 4 years after MAD started, they were able to pass a national minimum age legal drinking act, which actually raised the age of legal drinking in this country, which many states had as 18 to 21. That has been tied to reducing vehicle crashes by up to 16%, which is pretty significant in terms of saving lives. In 1985, that's when the language was changed from accident to crash. They wanted to make sure that people understood that this activity, this behavior, this choice was actually criminal. And then by 1988, just 8 years, now that seems like a lot if you're doing the work every day, but in retrospect, 8 years is not a lot of time for MAD to get all 50 states and DC to agree to uphold the MLDA I just referenced. And then we saw, as a country, drinking and driving decrease by about 20%. And then when you talk more about cultural work, MAD didn't just didn't change the laws in this country. They also were instrumental in the facilitation of sobriety checkpoints, something we're all familiar with today, but in 1990, that was really unheard of. In fact, some states still view them as unconstitutional, but they do have them now in 38 states and the District of Columbia. And if you have experienced a sobriety checkpoint, basically it just checks vehicles, regardless of how you're driving, to ensure that you are not impaired, and then anyone who is taken off the road. By 1995, 15 years after the organization started, they were able to really address their mission generally of not just passing laws federally and in every state, but also they started to reach out to youth. So again, the parallel I see with Moms Demand Action, which we started Students Demand Action in earnest after the Parkland shooting tragedy, that is when Students Against Drunk Driving, or SAD, started as a movement. Overall, if you look back since 1980, which is now almost 50 years or over 40, drunk driving has been cut in half in this country. About 350,000 lives have been saved by MAD's work. They have helped over 850,000 victims as an organization, another piece of this cultural work. And just like Moms Demand Action, there are lots of chapters of MAD all throughout, not just America now, but throughout the world. And I've told this story before, and I tell it in my book, which is, one of the first things I did when I started Moms Demand Action was to pick up the phone and to call the CEO of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, who was Debbie Weir at the time, and just said to her, I am interested in starting an organization like MAD, but for gun safety, can you help me? And she just happened to be working the MAD hotline that day, and we had many, many meetings, and she was really instrumental and helpful in getting Moms Demand Action started. And in fact, we eventually hired her to be a part of our organization. She's just left the organization after 5 years to work on cancer prevention. But I think a lot of interesting synergies in the stories. The other two things I just wanted to touch on, especially around moms and women, two incredibly impactful cultural happenings in this movement. First, the Million Mom March, and then March for Our Lives. And so I'm not sure how much you know about the Million Mom March. I remember it very vividly happening, when I was a young mom. For those of you who don't know what spurred the Million Mom March, there was a white supremacist who went into a Jewish community center in Los Angeles in 1999, and he opened fire with a semi-automatic weapon. He wounded 3 children, a counselor, an office worker. And much like the Sandy Hook school shooting, there was so much video of children being walked out in a chain, terrified, scared, being comforted by educators and parents. And there was a woman who saw this happening. Her name was Donna Dees Thomases, and she picked up the phone and called a friend named Amy Putnam. And they decided what we needed in this country to stop gun violence. And keep in mind, Columbine and all different kinds of shooting tragedies were happening, mass shooting tragedy were happening around then. And they decided that they would hold a Million Mom March. And their slogan was looking for a few good moms. And this was everywhere in an attempt to turn out Million Moms, right? The name Million Mom March. And it really became this, this brand that was a rallying cry. And it was branding for what was meant to be, and ultimately was the largest and most publicized gun safety rally in American history at that time. The rally was on Mother's Day. It was in Washington, D.C. And what was unfortunate was the name Million Mom March. They didn't quite make 1 million people. Some say it was like 750,000 people on the National Mall. There were thousands more people who had their own marches, not at the mall, but in their states and communities. But it really was incredibly powerful. Rosie O'Donnell was the spokesperson. She was very famous at the time, kind of at her apex of popularity, and it impacted a lot of women who wanted to run for office, who were worried about this issue, who wanted to become activists. There are many volunteers who attended that Million Mom March who went on to become lawmakers and famous activists and advocates. And then so sadly that did not, it resulted in cultural change, but not legislative change. And that was a little bit of their goal, right? To get federal action. And then 20 years later, almost, it was 18 years later, the tragedy happened in Parkland, Florida. And I tell this story too in my book. When the tragedy in Parkland happened, it was February, it was 2018, it was an election year, and the thought was, we really need to put all of our resources into changing the legislation this session. Session had just started in most states, and looking forward to electoral politics. And I can remember posting on Facebook and even saying to, friends and family, I understand you want to have a march. I understand that would be the logical, emotional, preferable thing to do, but it doesn't make a lot of practical sense. And I was sitting in my bedroom one day. It was probably late February, and I got a call on my cell phone, and I answered it, and it was George Clooney. And he said, we're talking about this march. We would love to have you on board. And it was George Clooney. So I said, of course, that's brilliant. That's a great idea. We must have a march. And the rest is history. Many other people said the same thing, including the survivors in Parkland, Florida. And that's exactly what we did. Everytown for Gun Safety was actually the co-sponsor of the large march, but also our volunteers hosted these marches in the communities where they lived in every state across the country. The march in Washington, D.C. drew over 100,000 people. There were marches on every single continent. And it was, yes, to change a culture, to get students involved, to have people talking about this issue, but also it was ultimately to hopefully get federal action on legislation, which didn't happen. There were states that changed their laws because of Parkland. But turnout at that march was, about 2 million people, which is incredibly significant. It was one of the largest protests in American history. And if nothing else, it certainly changed our culture and got more students involved. And there's so many different stories about women getting involved in activism. Apologies, this keeps going forward. Everything from climate change to clean water, to equal rights, to pay. There's Moms for Climate Change. The mothers in Flint, Michigan have been at the forefront of making water safer for their community. And certainly here we are in 2022, and there's still no equal rights amendment. So why does cultural change matter? We've talked a lot about how women have played a role in that, and what that has looked like in the gun violence prevention movement. And there are a lot of reasons. First of all, corporations, CEOs, business leaders, they have a lot of say in the policy that's made in this country. And we're going to be talking about examples and how this works. But we have changed corporate policy, mostly getting companies to disallow open carry inside their stores. And I can remember, we had some big wins early on, for example, Starbucks and Target. And we decided that we would go after Chipotle because we saw people carrying semi-automatic rifles inside their stores. And it only took a weekend. Our hashtag was burritos, not bullets. And the next day on CNBC, the first thing that reporter asked then Governor of Texas, Rick Perry, was, what do you think about Chipotle's decision? And so it just goes to show that companies and corporate leaders do put pressure on lawmakers, and they do make a difference, especially if those companies are based in the state a lawmaker is running. Creating coalitions to change culture is important. When we go to state houses to affect legislative change, we try to have people from law enforcement, educators, first responders, and even when possible, corporations. And certainly I can remember a number of times we've either had letters sent to Congress that are signed by CEOs, or in state houses we've asked corporations to be on our side of a certain issue. And it's not just corporations that help change the culture, it's also influencers. When we first started this organization, Everytown for Gun Safety, which Moms Demand Action and Students Demand Action are the grassroots arm of, one thing we put together is something called the Creative Council. And that includes authors and actors and athletes. And they are all committed to using their voices and their influence around this issue. Julianne Moore, who is an Academy Award-winning actress, really is at the forefront of the Cultural Council. She has done a lot of work to get celebrities and influencers to motivate and to mobilize around the issue of gun safety. We've had a lot of success, for example, around Wear Orange. Wear Orange is another cultural change. It's a weekend each year where we bring attention to the crisis of gun violence in a sort of a non-political way. We're just saying that this is a tragedy, that gun violence in this country is preventable and senseless, and we're all committed to stopping it. And so athletes certainly play an important role, whether it's branding themselves orange during games, dedicating their games to gun violence survivors, and using their voices and votes. And I think they're particularly effective and influential with younger audiences. And then the last thing I'd bring up about cultural change are different education programs. So we've talked about corporations, we've talked about influencers, but there's also non-political ways to change culture, and that includes education. And I could give you a lot of examples. I think the one that's most important that we work on as an organization is Be Smart. And this is a campaign where we educate gun owners and non-gun owners alike, mostly parents, about how to keep your gun securely stored. That means it's locked, unloaded, separate from ammunition. And the way we work on this culturally is putting out ads, working to send materials home, handing out gun locks, and just generally educating the general public about secure gun storage. Yes, we do that electorally. We definitely encourage lawmakers to support changing the laws around this issue. We certainly support legislation that is passed that changes the laws around secure storage, but also this education component, showing up at farmers markets and at grocery stores and at sporting events with our table, with information about secure storage, remembering that about 4.6 million kids in this country live in homes with unsecured guns. So I want to talk more about culture. I want to talk more about what it's like to do this work in a red state when lawmakers aren't necessarily passing laws. And with that, I will introduce our Texas volunteer, Norri Leder. Norri, how are you?
Doing great. Thanks, Shannon.
It's so good to see you. So if you don't mind, just tell us, how did you get involved in this issue to begin with? I know the answer to this, but nobody else does.
Right. I got involved after the Sandy Hook shootings. I still had one of my two children in elementary school, and it was one of those moments I'll never forget where I was when I heard about the story and began listening and realized that there but for the grace of God go I. And I thought, surely people are going to do something about this. And I wasn't even on Facebook at that point. I was not a social media person. And I emailed a bunch of friends, and then shortly after that opened a Facebook account and asked people to stand outside of Senator John Cornyn's Houston office with me and ask him to take action. And shortly after that, a friend directed me to a woman named Shannon Watts, and that's how I got involved.
I remember that call well, almost 10 years later. And I remember that you had so much passion and so much anger around this issue. Did you think that mass shooting was going to affect change in Texas?
I thought it would affect mass change around the country. I really did. I thought, surely we're not, this is it, right? I mean, we're not going to allow a bunch of kindergartners and educators to be shot up this way and be so vulnerable. Yes, I did. I absolutely thought change would come pretty quickly, or I was hoping for that.
And so what was the reality that you experienced in Texas in the months and years after that tragedy?
As many can probably imagine, it's been painstaking at times. What I will say is that I told myself in the beginning, if I felt that I wasn't making headway within a year or two, I would let it go. I was not going to make myself miserable working on something where I felt I wasn't making headway. And I have to say, I think we've made a tremendous amount of headway. It is painstaking at times. It's not quick enough, but I've seen gun violence prevention become a very big issue in Texas in a way that it was not at all when I started working on this. And that's very rewarding and gives me the energy to keep going forward, because I can see it. It may take me another 10 years, but I feel like it's within sight.
Well, I can remember in those early days when so many volunteers would show up in their red shirts. And it was really shocking to Texas lawmakers who thought they could just keep passing their agenda through the state house. And I'm not saying that's not what they've done, but you all have given them a run for their money. I mean, you are opposing them at every turn.
We absolutely have given them a really rough time, and they're very uncomfortable around us. And another component of that is that when I started working on this, Democrats did not want to be associated with Moms
Right.
Demand Action or gun violence prevention. I mean, I can remember a time when Wendy Davis's campaign asked us to take down a post on social media of us standing with her. That was a long, long time ago. And now, not only is that not happening, they are actively seeking us out. Democrats and even some moderate Republicans in some instances, are seeking us out to sit down, to come up with solutions, to ask us for our thoughts on policy and ways to block bad policies as well.
When we talk about corporate work or cultural work, and a lot of you have really spearheaded the Signage campaign that I want to get more into. But when I think about this work, it takes me back to what I think was 2014. And I can remember driving to the airport, and I think I was on a call with you and some other volunteers, and they said, some of our volunteers went to a lunch meeting at a restaurant in Arlington, Texas, and they looked out, there was like 4 of them, and they had posted about this meeting on Facebook, and they looked out the window, and they saw a truck or two, and a bunch of people, mostly men, mostly white men, pulling long guns out of their trucks. And they were posing with them, and they were sort of trying to intimidate them. I mean, it was all because of this meeting. And the volunteers told the manager, and he said, basically everyone said, well, this is not against the law. This is perfectly legal in the state of Texas. There's nothing we can do. And that got worldwide attention. I mean, what do you remember about that incident?
I remember it very well. I think at that point I was the state chapter lead. So the woman that had organized that meeting up in Arlington, it was at some restaurant, called me and said, these open carry folks are outside the restaurant, a big group of them with a bunch of rifles, and they're intimidating us. It was a very quick whirlwind after that, a lot of media attention. And I remember it running in all the Texas papers, but quickly spreading to the New York Times and other places. And it makes me think a lot about the section in your book, Fight Like a Mother, where you talk about losing forward. And I think that's a big part of the cultural work on this issue. it was legal. It still is legal to open carry rifles in Texas in public. But a lot of people don't know that. And so what you're able to do with an issue like this is take the visual images of that and share it all over the place and let people know this is legal and this is kooky. This is absolutely dangerous and crazy and frightening that you can go to a regular restaurant at your local strip mall and some guy can parade around, or 10 guys can parade around, or 20 with rifles outside the restaurant to intimidate you. And it really raised a lot of awareness around the issue, and we were able to use it on the open carry front to our advantage a lot.
Well, and I think that you're right. I mean, that is really the point at which a few things happened. One, as you said, people were realizing that this was legal in over 40 states, that you could open carry and it was pretty much unregulated, and it was the next frontier of gun extremists. But the other thing that was interesting that happened was the NRA had to choose a side, and they really were confused because they came out and said a couple things. First, they said, because they were getting pressure from open carry people in Texas, they said it was downright weird. And I think they also called it dangerous.
Yes.
And said it wasn't something that normal people did, but they had to recant just days later because they got so much pressure from extremists, and they really had to take a side on the issue.
They did. They were forced into a more extreme corner than they even thought was appropriate. And, of course, we've seen in the years since the gun rights movement move even to more and more extreme scenarios. But that's exactly correct. And we also leveraged during those times when we would discover that some of these open carry groups were going to other locations to try and quote unquote normalize open carry. And I remember we would get on the phone and call the property owners and let them know in advance, hey, a bunch of people are planning to come to your Subway shop or wherever they were going, and to open carry rifles, and we would shut them down before they got there, and make alliances with folks in the business community in the process because they appreciated that we were informing them about it.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that, the alliances and the cultural work. So, when it's tough, particularly in red states, to elect gun sense candidates, when it's tough to pass good gun laws, and you're spending so much of your time playing defense in a state legislature, tell me about the importance of cultural work and partnerships and what that has looked like for you in your state.
I think it's become a critical component for the work that we do. We have been able to form alliances, and I use the term alliance loosely because some folks are more comfortable openly aligning with us and others just line up with us on issues. But we're constantly reaching out to folks in the business community, other community stakeholders, places like the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo, for example, or the Texas Apartment Association, groups like that, to let them know about legislation that's coming through or policies that impact their membership and their attendees. And they have come out with very strong positions. Places like that, whether it's testifying in the State House to try and block a bad bill, whether it's implementing a very strict no gun policy and at public events and making sure people are aware of that. There are a variety of ways that we've been able to form those alliances. We've also been able to form alliances with individual businesses and even religious congregations that have been impacted by some of these laws, and there have been lawsuits that Everytown has brought as a result of them. And so there's a number of ways to leverage it, and to also make sure that we're advancing what I would call a normal gun policy. And if you're outside, if you think carrying your AR-15 into Target is normal, well, you belong in the smoking room. You're not with the rest of us.
Right. Exactly. So, Norri, I want to talk about your signage campaign because I think it's a good example of why cultural work matters, especially in states where it's tough to do this work legislatively and electorally. If you wouldn't mind just walking us through the genesis of that campaign, how it started, and the headway you've made. What's it been like?
Sure. Well, when I started working on this issue way back in the beginning with Shannon, when I had just met her, I would frequently in some of my Google searches come up upon this website called Texas3006.com. I didn't know what it was. I would kind of go onto it periodically because it kept coming up, and I would see things like invalid sign, so forth, so on. It was just these like a giant table of businesses. And I finally figured out this was a website that was run by, I guess, gun rights extremists that captured every business that people logged into it. And there are no gun signage, whether they had it or not. So it included thousands of listings of places like, the Chuck E. Cheese on, around the corner from me, or the Jewish Community Center, or the Red Cross, Habitat for Humanity. These are all actual locations that I remember seeing listed there. And they would list whether the no gun sign that the business had posted was legal or not. And I thought, well, what do you mean? Don't you just put up a sign that says no guns allowed? Well, it turns out that the gun lobby had passed a law shortly after concealed carry passed in the early 90s in Texas. Because so many businesses were posting no gun signs, they created a law that required businesses, if they wanted to prohibit guns on their own property, they had to post this very specific sign, which it turns out is roughly the size of a movie poster and includes boilerplate language that no one would know what the boilerplate language was saying. It's like pursuant to statute 83.12C, so forth and so, I mean, on and on and on. And it had to be in both English and Spanish in order to be valid.
I think you sent a picture of, what was it, a pony?
Yes, we took a picture of the poster next to a pony, and we also took a picture of it next to a 5-year-old child.
So in other words, it's not small government when you're taking up this much space in a company's window.
That's right. That's right. And it had to be font sized. There had to, the lettering had to be a certain font size. And on this website, as I dug into it, it made me angrier and angrier. I saw people saying, oh, well, the sign at the Chevron over by me, their lettering is only 7/8 of an inch tall. It's not 1 inch tall. So I'm carrying my gun in the convenience store when I, buy my chewing gum after I get gas or whatever. And it just seeing it infuriated me. And we ended up being able to harness it into this very powerful campaign to show that folks that were advancing gun laws in Texas were not, in fact, responsible gun owners. They were people that were gaming businesses and trying to get the better of well-meaning folks that were trying to look out for the safety of their patrons or patients or day campers or whoever they might be, in charge of.
And it's had very significant outcomes, right? I mean, you've had a lot of success in getting these placed. And I can remember even an NRA board member who lives in Texas, Charles Cotton, at one point said, I wish we'd never passed this law because now I can bring my gun fewer places than before.
Yes, I think what it ended up doing was, and that was one of the things that Charles Cotton, the board member, lamented so much, is that it brought awareness to this signage law, which had really been very obscure. I don't think most businesses knew about it. And these gun extremists were really relying on that so that they could carry their guns into more and more places. And so when open carry was actually passed in Texas, we used that as an opportunity to educate the entire state about how to prohibit guns on your businesses, on your business premises, whether it's open carry, concealed carry, whatever it may be. And yes, and we ended up getting a lot of businesses to prohibit guns altogether. And we got major chains and corporations to prohibit open carry for sure.
And you even have given people signs or told them how to make the signs. And I know that we've now replicated this in other states, your whole idea around a signage campaign.
Yes, we have. We did do that. We had some signs printed out. We also provided PDFs because the signs were so big, you can't print them out on a standard printer. So we provided links so that people could send them to printers and have them printed out. We also, I recall, worked with a newspaper, I believe in Austin, where they took pages, a couple pages of their newspaper, like the entire pages, and printed the signs so that businesses could just cut those out. They were big enough to post directly in their windows.
Well, I am so grateful for all of your work, for your creativity, because that's what it has taken. And it's lovely to see these end runs around people who think they're just going to, pass their agenda and do whatever they want to do. Constituent desires be damned. Norri, leave us with, what do you see as the future of these kinds of campaigns and gun safety in Texas?
I think, especially in red states and places like Texas, I think the future is continued passion and continued work and valuing the voice of every single person that shares this perspective, which is the vast majority of us. I think it's been very, very powerful to be just sort of a regular stay-at-home mom. I ended up becoming a stay-at-home mom because I got so involved with this. But those voices have had tremendous impact on lawmakers and on elected officials around the state. And even though things aren't where I want them to be at the state level, we've got incredible allies at the local level, at the county level, and on the state level, we do, even though we're in the minority. So we just have to keep plugging away, celebrate every win, and welcome every person that wants to work with us on it. And have fun.
That's right. That's key. Have fun. Thank you so much, Norri, and so grateful for your time and your talent and your insight today.
Always happy to do it.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. So next, we're going to talk a bit about partnerships, and then we're going to bring in our two panelists. But why are partnerships important? I think it dovetails a lot with why the cultural work we do is important. First of all, something that I've learned, and as the younger generation students, you know this sort of intuitively, but all issues are intersectional. It's really never just about gun violence. It also may be about misogyny or racism or bigotry, domestic violence. There's so many different issues that touch one another, and it's really important to look at issues holistically. I've said before, I got off the sidelines and got involved in this issue because I was a white suburban mom who was scared my kids weren't safe in their schools. And what I learned very quickly was that mass shootings and school shootings are about 1% of the gun violence in this country, and that there were a lot of solutions that we needed to be looking at to address both gun homicide and gun suicide. And that includes in city centers and in rural communities. So I just think it's really important to remember that whenever you're working on an issue, that it does not exist in a vacuum. Coalition building is key. I say this next, but no one organization can fix all the problems. Everytown for Gun Safety can no more fix gun violence than one single organization fixed the issue with marriage equality. It wasn't just HRC. It was so many different organizations, so many different partnerships that led to marriage equality. Every issue really does require a lot of different people sitting at the table with their unique perspectives, time, talent, ideas, most of all, insight from where they live and the community that they're in, and what solutions will actually work and be effective and not harmful. And also, when you go into, for example, a legislative hearing, it's really important that it's a broad swath of the community, of society that's represented. It's going to make the most meaningful argument for change and reform, especially when those people are experts like law enforcement and first responders. And then all politics is local. It's a saying that goes back decades, but it's more true than ever. We have an intractable Senate. It's not just like gun safety is not passing through the Senate. There are really very few issues that the Senate is willing to act on. The House is a different story, but the Senate is the Senate we have. And so all the more reason why we should be doing two things. One, putting pressure on the administration to take executive action, but also to work at a hyper-local level. And that includes partnerships with people in your community so that you can put pressure on school boards and city councils, in town hall meetings, and obviously in your state house as well. So we are going to talk more about partnerships with our panel now. I'm very excited to invite Celeste Iroha and Katie Fox to join us, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves.
I am so sorry. Let me find a way to.
Hey, Celeste, you there? Oh, she's on mute. Okay, so Katie, I see you. If you don't mind just introducing yourself, Katie, and telling us who you are and what you do.
So my name's Katie Fox, and I joined Moms after the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. I'm a Jew who lives in Charlottesville, and I was downtown when that happened, and felt the fear, honestly, that white supremacists had taken over my town and were out to kill anyone who wasn't white. Our local group of Moms Demand Action started a little after that point, and that gave an outlet for me to really put that the outrage from that instance into effect. I'm a gun violence survivor. I lost a good friend in high school to gun suicide. And I myself dealt with suicidal thoughts for a long time. My life was saved by my father's safe storage. So our Be Smart message has been extremely important to me as a volunteer. I live in a small town in Virginia. So I live just outside of Charlottesville now. And so a lot of the work that I do ends up being a bridge building between your suburban and rural areas. So between being a gun owner and working in these smaller spaces, it's created a really unique outlook to how we focus on gun violence.
Thank you, Katie, and I want to get more into that in a minute. Celeste, I see you've joined us. Thank you so much. If you don't mind just telling us, who you are and about the work you do.
Hi, everyone. My name is Celeste. I identify as a gun violence survivor. I'm also a student. I have lost too many people to gun violence. My first experience with gun violence started when I was 12 in DC, where my cousin lost his life trying to get better. And ever since then, it's just been cases upon cases of gun violence in my family that I've lost loved ones to. Considering my uncle, the DoorDash driver who was shot and killed in Maryland just for doing his job. The work that I do, I really feel like I'm always there if they need somebody in Everytown or Students in Action. And I feel like it's helping to change my community. Anyway.
Celeste, first of all, I'm very sorry to hear about your experiences with gun violence. It's all too common in this country. Can you tell us a little bit about the work you do with partners and the work you're doing to change the culture of gun violence where you live?
Well, I live in Maryland. I work and go to school in DC, where every day there's a case of gun violence. And working with Everytown Students Demand Action and other partners, like we're putting on an event on Wednesday where we're partnering with the Trigger Project. Hopefully somebody can come from them, but they're based in DC. It's basically having a partnership is very important for us and the work that we do. So I just feel like it's the main thing, like it's the main aspect of what we do, because we can't do it by ourselves.
So let's talk a little bit more about what you do, what your group does.
We basically hold events. Like, we don't have a chapter here on campus. I tried to make it here, but my school doesn't really, do that. But my group that I'm starting outside of SDA and the SDA DC chapter, we do hold events, we do workshops, we do trainings on these types of issues, and being able to hold events and speak to the community about what's going on, how the gun violence prevention can be a good way to, engage the community and make sure we're not losing a future. Because in many cases that we don't have a future because we lose too many people to gun violence, whether it be a young or an old person.
So just to be clear, just for everyone watching us, you work with outside groups, but you're also here with us today as a representative of Students Demand Action. So thank you so much. Katie, tell us a little bit about the work you're doing with how does it dovetail with the importance of partnerships and changing the culture? You talked a lot about rural gun violence.
So a lot of rural gun violence ends up being the suicide portion of our data. And so organizations like the Gun Shop Project that talk about secure storage and our Be Smart program, those sort of things dovetail very nicely together. And we can talk about that at our tables at events. And we can talk about that with our rural lawmakers who aren't necessarily on our side. I had an instance, not this past session, but the session before, where my delegate in our state house is a Republican. He's not one of the crazy ones, luckily, but he never votes for our bills. But when we talked to him on Advocacy Day, we had multiple suicide loss survivors on the call. And as all of us brought up our stories and about why this was important to us, he had a light bulb moment. And he said, I have had 5 families that I know lose somebody to gun suicide the past year. This is something I want to work on. What? After never hearing a word in our favor, we had multiple meetings with him about what could be done and where we could find movement, whether it was working with community service boards or with, in Virginia, we have the Lock and Talk program, which is a part of the Gun Shop Project. And ways that we could integrate the conversation into rural communities that aren't necessarily willing to talk about gun violence because it's seen as a threat to their culture.
Celeste, what has it been like working on this issue as a student? Do you feel like you are taken seriously? Do you feel you bring a different perspective to this issue as a student?
I feel being a student and being an activist at the same time, I feel like our perspective is more different because, we're in a different generation than the people who are elected or the older generation that may have experienced gun violence in the past and how they have been able to handle it. I go to school with so many people that went to Parkland during the time the shooting happened. It's like teaming up. We are out there because our elected officials who we help put there because they say they are gun sense laws who are not really doing the job that we want them to. So I feel like as a student and somebody that has survived or somebody that identifies as a gun violence survivor, I feel like our aspect or my aspect as a student activist in this movement has really changed rather than the generation before me. So I feel like it's making a positive impact because the younger generation is actually the ones on the forefront rather than the old people who said what they were going to do.
What advice, Celeste, would you give to the students watching about either getting involved in this issue or building a bigger tent so that they are working with other partners on this issue?
I would say just go for it because honestly, you may have so many no's for people that you're going to talk to for your officials or for people you're going to talk to like, hey, I don't want to support this, but maybe somebody else will. You may take many no's, but that one yes will be, the needle in the haystack or something that may get you where you actually want to go. So don't give up because it's like in the line of work that we do, there's going to be a lot of naysayers or a lot of no's rather than yeses. But it just
That is
takes that one
exactly
yes.
right. Thank you so much, Les. Katie, tell us, what have you learned from the activism you've done with Moms Demand Action, with other groups, especially when it comes to changing the culture, creating partnerships, and building a big tent?
So a big thing I would say is to not alienate gun owners. Most gun owners are responsible, follow safety rules, and truly believe in all the things that our activism espouses. It's a lot of misinformation has been put out, and we are having to combat that. And so whether it's that you bring a gun owner with you to a table, or you have them at a meeting, or they come to a legislative meeting with you, there's a lot of credibility that's gained when you make sure that your tent includes people who are affected on that side of the issue, as well as the survivors.
Last question for both of you. Katie, I'll start with you. People who are watching, students who want to get involved, what can they do to join you?
Like Celeste said, just show up. Just show up, because talking with somebody about this issue that is also passionate about it raises my excitement. It gives me a boost. It refills my cup. And I hear that from every single volunteer, is that as soon as you have this affirming confirmation, that conversation, everybody's cup is refilled and you're back in the movement.
Thank you, Katie. Celeste, we'll end with you. We are definitely trying to get a Students Demand Action chapter started at American University, but is there anything coming up that students can join? That you mentioned you have one meeting coming up.
Yes, this Wednesday at 4:30 to 6 at Trinity Washington University, which is where I go. We're doing like an honoring those we lost type of thing, where we're just having speakers come in, we're sharing stories and sharing like how to get involved with our organizations, or, to get into the movement. So like she said, like Katie said, show up, be there, you don't have to be a survivor. You can be an ally, and you can just, help raise awareness.
Well, I am so indebted to you both for taking your time today. You are both such amazing activists. I see you doing your work in your communities all the time. And I just really do want to thank you for sharing your insights with the audience today. Thank you for all you do.
Thank you.
Anytime.
Okay, and with that, I just want to leave everyone with some next steps, which we do at the end of this discussion. First, if you want to start a Students Demand Action chapter, join a Students Demand Action chapter, you just have to text the word students to 64433. We did not, we had someone coming from the Nra Center today, and unfortunately she was sick, but that is an organization in DC that is doing amazing work. So if you want to find out about how you can help out, if you're spending a lot of time in DC, you can go to the nraroncenter.org. What is your home state doing? Do you have permitless carry? Are you one of the states now? I think it's like 24 states that have passed this law. You probably do have open carry if you live in one of the 40 states that allow it almost unregulated. Do you know the requirements to get a gun permit? Do you know how your state gun laws line up against the rest of the nation? Just go to everytownresearch.org/rankings, and you can find so much information at the Everytown website about guns and gun laws and how to talk about this issue. And then, Katie talked about suicide in rural communities, and in particular, if you want to learn more about red flag laws and how you can help prevent suicide, just go to onethingyoucando.org. That's an Everytown supported website where you can learn more about how to take advantage of red flag laws if you are one of the 19 states that has those now. So thank you again for joining us today. Hope you come back. We are having our last session, which will sum up everything that we've talked about over the last 4 sessions, and how to organize around any issue using gun safety as an example. That is on April 18th, and I look forward to seeing you all again then. Thanks so much.